Good evening, everyone. I'm Darrell Cunningham. I'm board chair for the Fort Smith Area Community Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our celebration of philanthropy. Thank you so much for being here. The first Philanthropist of the Year award given by our organization was in 2004 to Mark Rumsey. Many of you know Mark. Other awardees have been Robert Hernreich, Raleigh Borum, H.L. Hembry, and Donnie Pendergraft. You can see that it's not awarded every year, only when we believe that there's someone deserving, someone like tonight's honoree, Robert E. Bob Miller. Reciting a complete list of the organizations which have benefited from Bob's help both in funds and work would take quite a long while. So I'll mention a few by category. First, in higher education, UA Fort Smith, Hendrix College, Hillsdale College, Midwestern State University. Community organizations, Bob established the Community Rescue Mission and also supported the Good Samaritan Clinic, Antioch District Association, Interfaith Community Center, Hannah House, United Way, Habitat for Humanity. The Miller branch of the public library bears the name of Bob and the late Joni Miller at that site. Religious organizations, First United Methodist Church, the Lewis Center at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C., United Methodist Higher Education, Church of the Resurrection in Kansas, the United Christian Ashram, and the Foundation for Evangelism. If this is not enough, and I assure you this is not a complete list, for a number of years, Bob went to Haiti each summer to dig water wells, okay? Every good man that I know has a good woman as his support and help, and the same is true for Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, would you show our appreciation for Nadine Hardin Miller and Robert E. Bob Miller. Now there is a reason behind Bob's philanthropy, something that he calls the rest of the story. So Bob, please come forward, accept your award, and tell us that story. It's my pleasure to award you Philanthropist of the Year 2016, Fort Smith Area Community Foundation. Thank you for your good work. Thank
you. This is a wonderful honor, and I would never have expected it to be me, because a philanthropist is something that I don't associate with myself. And in order to be a philanthropist, you have to have money. And I had never had money for most of my life until I was 50 years old. Now, I want to tell you one of the stories that really changed my life. My degree is in animal husbandry, and my wife and I lived on a ranch the first 4 years we were married. And then we went to work in the oil field, and we moved to Abilene, Texas. My father-in-law had a friend in the drilling business, and so I went to work roughnecking on one of his drilling rigs. But over time, I worked my way up and became a contact person for Gilchrist Drilling Company. Now, a funny thing was happening, and not a funny thing, but a drastic thing was happening in the oil field. After World War II, we needed oil. So people bought a lot of drilling rigs and kept them busy. But then in 1955, we were importing oil from Saudi Arabia cheaper than we could drill for it. Now, a drilling rig is only good for one thing, and that's to drill a hole in the ground. And if nobody is drilling holes in the ground, it is not worth very much. The contractor I was working for had 5 rigs, and this began to happen in about 1955. And in 56, and I noticed when I was calling on people, nobody was looking for contractors. And he told me one day that he was going to turn 2 rigs back because he couldn't afford to make the payments, and suggested I take one of those rigs and go in the drilling business. Now, when I came to work in the oil field, I noticed how much waste there was. And on the ranch, we didn't waste anything. So I thought if I could just cut out the waste, I could make a living. So after much prayer and meditation, I started Miller Drilling Company in 1957 with 1 rig. Now, the only way I could get a contract in Abilene, where there were about a dozen drilling companies, was to be the low bidder. And I was the low bidder. And so consequently, I had to learn how to drill wells fast and cut out the waste. I survived for about 4 years, but when you're always the low bidder, there's a lot of the times you don't make a profit. So by about 4 years into this, I had my rig stacked over around Breckenridge, and I was bidding on a well in Palo Pinto County. It was not very far from my rig, and I had an old Chevrolet truck and a single axle float. And a driller and I spent about a week moving all of our little stuff over there. And then we got 4 contract trucks to move our big rigs, our big stuff. I was hoping that we would get over there in time the first day to rig up and start drilling, but my crews were all short-handed. So it was obvious to me the main thing to do was to get rid of the contract trucks, so we got them off the payroll. And I sent my drillers back to town to get a full crew and come out the next day. And they did, and they showed up, and we started drilling. Now, before you can drill a well, the first thing you do is to drill a rat hole. A rat hole is about a 45-foot hole on the side of the derrick where you could put the Kelly in when you were making a trip. Now, usually you just pump those down in 30 minutes or an hour, no problem. This day we hit solid rock at 15 feet, and that bit was just jumping up and down. And I tried to figure out how I could get weight on that bit. And the only thing I could figure out was to back that Chevrolet truck up, rig up a snatch block on the back of the truck and run it up and tie it to the swivel and hang the truck on that swivel. And it worked. So we got through the rock, got the rat hole set, started drilling the surface hole. We were going to set 600 feet of surface. We got down to about 250 feet and lost circulation. Now, if you know anything about the drilling business, you know you pump water down the drill pipe, out the end of the bit, and it comes out on top of the ground, carrying the cuttings with them. If you lose circulation, that means it doesn't come up. Here it goes out into the formation. Now, if you're lucky, it will take the cuttings out there and stop it up. Not today. They stacked up around the bit and stuck my drill pipe. And we couldn't move it up or down or rotate, and worked, and finally got the bit up, mixed up the lost circulation material, got circulation back, and started drilling. Well, I'd been up the night before to be sure the water pump stayed running, so I was exhausted. And I went out and went sound asleep in my car. I hadn't been asleep 15 minutes till the driller came down and said, "We've got something wrong with that back engine." So we went up and pulled the side plates off, and we'd broken the crankshaft in the back engine. I came down off of that rig floor a completely defeated young man. And I stopped by my car and reached in and got a little New Testament and put it in my pocket, walked up on the knoll overlooking the rig, and poured out my heart to the Lord. And I said, "I thought you wanted me in the drilling business, and I've worked my head off for 4 years, and I'm farther behind now than I was when I started. And if I don't get this hole drilled, I will not even have enough money to pay my crews." So by that time, it was getting daylight, and I went on to say, "If you want me to stay in the drilling business, you're going to have to show me in a way that I will understand." And I pulled out, it was getting daylight, and I pulled out the little New Testament. And I'd never read that before. The 5th chapter of Romans said, read the 3rd verse, "Rejoice in your suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. And hope will not disappoint us, for God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us." Well, I read that over and I meditated on it, I don't know how long. And I was thinking about that last verse that said, God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. And it suddenly dawned on me, I'd been trying to do all this myself. And I think it was time for me to get the Lord involved. So all of a sudden, and I can't explain it, I felt like a load had been lifted off of my shoulder. And I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that everything was going to be all right. Well, I went bounding down off of that knoll and up on the rig floor. And I told the driller to keep drilling with one engine. And I was going to Abilene and see what I could find. I walked into Waukesha Pierce place, and they knew me. He said, "Hey, Bob, how's it going?" I said, "I broke a crankshaft in my back engine." "Oh, no problem. We'll sell you a new one for $10,000. I said, "I haven't got $10,000. And the manager was listening to this, and he came out of the back of his office, and he said, "What did you say you needed?" And I said, "I need an LRO Waukesha." And he said, "Yesterday, about quitting time, Wichita Falls store called me and said they had taken in an unusually good LRO Waukesha, and did I know anybody that needed one?" And I said, "Well, what could you trade with me for?" And he said, "Well, if it's only a broken crankshaft, I can trade with you for $2,000. I said, "I'll take it. Tell them to load it up on the truck, and when I get surface set, I'll call them." So I got in my truck, my car, and drove back to the rig, and they were circulating. They had the hole cut, and I called Wichita Falls and told them to send that way with the engine. We set the surface and got it cemented. You have to wait 24 hours for the cement to set. And while we were doing that, we changed out the back engine. That was the second miracle. Now the third miracle was this. I had bid on that well. It was a 4,000-foot hole, and I bid $4 a foot, which meant I could gross $16,000. Now back then, if I could gross $1,000 a day, I could make a profit. But I knew I could not afford to have any trouble if I drilled it in 16 days. So we started drilling, and we finished that well not in 16 days, but in 14 days. $2,000 extra dollars profit to pay for that engine. And well, I felt like that was a spiritual experience, and I felt like I was being called into the ministry. So I was talking to a friend of mine. I decided I was going to be the best drilling contractor I could be. And I was talking to a friend of mine who you all have probably all heard of, E. Stanley Jones. He was a missionary to India as a young man, and he had the best understanding of the scripture of anybody I'd ever talked to. And I told him this story. I said, I feel like I'm being called into the ministry, but I feel like also I need to be a drilling contractor. And he said this, all God wants is you. And if he has you, he will use you. He certainly needs Christian businessmen just as much as he needs Christian ministers. So from that time on, I determined to be the best drilling contractor I could be. Now, soon after that, a friend of mine came by my office and asked me how things were going. And I said, well, it's hard to keep my rig busy. People are just not drilling wells. And he said, well, you ought to take that rig to Arkansas. He said, I have taken an option on 300,000 acres in the Arkoma Basin. Now, I have some contractor friends in Oklahoma, but I don't have one in Arkansas. Why don't you move to Arkansas, and I'll keep that rig busy? Well, that would sound like an answer to prayer to me. So we loaded up the rig and moved it up there, and when we came across the state line, it said, welcome to Arkansas, the land of opportunity. Well, my friend said he'd keep my rig busy. Well, I drilled one well for him, and he said, move here. I drilled 3 wells, and at the end of the 3rd well, he said, well, I can't sell my deal. Well, here I was in Arkansas. I didn't know anybody, but I started calling on Gulf and Arkansas Western Gas. And since I had been drilling by the foot in Texas, where all the responsibility is on you to get that well drilled, in Arkansas, it was day work. Man, that sounded like an answer to prayer. If I worked 10 days, I got paid for 10 days. If I got worked 20 days, I got paid for 20 days. No pressure, except I put my knowledge of to drilling fast to do it, and consequently, it saved it saved the companies I was working for enough money that my reputation got out, and I was beginning to keep my rig busy. Now, then my friend called, and he had sold his deal, so he needed a rig, and I read in the paper where a rig was going to be auctioned off on the courthouse steps at Boonville. Somebody had moved over there with a turnkey contract and went broke. And this rig he walked off and left the rig, and they were auctioning it off the courthouse steps. Well, I was a successful bidder, so now I had 2 rigs. So I began to keep those pretty much busy. Well, that was that went on fairly well for a while, but then things got slow again, and it was beginning to get slow even in Arkansas. But then all during the 60s, it was slow, and I would get notices from my competitors who were going out of business and having auction sales. So I would go to these auction sales. I didn't have any money, but I would buy pieces and parts and derricks, and I was buying them so cheap, I really felt sorry for the people I was buying them from. I bought a drawworks, a derrick, and a substructure in Louisiana cheaper than it cost me more to truck it home than I paid for it. Now that went on all during the 60s, and I just had a yard full of rigs and pieces and parts. And then the oil embargo came, and you all remember that, when in 1973 you had to wait in line to get gasoline. And so then the phone started ringing, and they didn't even ask me what I charged. They asked me one question: can you get me a rig? And I said, yes. And at one time I had 20 welders in the back of my yard putting rigs together. About 66, I was beginning to had enough money to start buying rigs. Now in Arkansas, you drilled with natural gas, and so when an operator would want to drill a well, he would have to rent air compressors, and you'd have to rent a contractor, and then you'd have to pay for the trucking. So I began to buy air compressors so I could rent those. And then I rigged up trucks. I had a fleet of 12 tandem trucks, 40 air compressors, 12 drilling rigs, and I was by far the biggest drilling contractor in Arkansas. And the Tulsa World sent a reporter down to do an article on my company, and I have a copy of it right here. I opened the Tulsa World that week, and there was this on the front page, a whole page. And then my phone really started ringing then, and then a representative from W.R. Grace came by and wanted to talk to me. And he wanted to buy my company and made me an offer that I could not believe. I never heard of that much money. And I said, my company's not for sale. And so they went left, and I kept coining money with these rigs. And he called me back in about a month and upped the price again. And that went on for about 6 months. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and the Lord said, sell that company. So I said, I wondered how I was going to get back in touch with him without him thinking I'd changed my mind. And lo and behold, he said, I'm going to try to buy your company one more time, and upped it again. And I said, well, before I sell my company, I want to meet Mr. Grace. And he said, well, that's no problem. So they flew my wife and me up to New York City, put us up in the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, took it out, a vice president took us out to dinner and a show on Thursday night, and another dinner and a show on Friday night. Then he took me up to the top of the Grace building on 6th Avenue and introduced me to Peter Grace. And then he left, and Mr. Grace was the only one up there on Saturday morning. So we visited for a little while, and he said, well, I understand you're thinking about selling your company. So I went into my selling mode. I said, Mr. Grace, I started that company when I was 27 years old. I've got some of the finest crews in the basin. In fact, I probably have the finest small drilling company in the United States. I've got a son graduating from law school this year. I have a son-in-law that works for me. Now, if you were me, would you sell your company to W.R. Grace? And he kind of smiled, and then he said, yes, I would, and I'll tell you why. He said, if we make our deal, your people will be my people. And I feel about my folks just like you do about yours. And he said, I have 7 children, and only one of them even works for this company. And he has no desire to run it. And number 3, and this was the selling point, he said, if we make our deal, it will make your estate planning a lot simpler. So we agreed on a price, and I agreed to stay on for 6 years and 5 years and run the company. And so that's what I did. And then even after I left, they kept me on those pays as a consultant. Well, then when we closed our deal on the 15th of January in 1980, that was 5 days after my 50th birthday. So here I was, 50 years old, and I had a lot of money, and so I determined to try to be the best philanthropist I could be. And I didn't know how to spell the word then, and I don't hardly know how now. But anyway, I did stay on 5 years and run the company. That was January, and then in February, we had a real cold February. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I could hear sleet hitting against the roof. And I just lay there being very thankful that I had a good, warm place to sleep. My next thought was, what about people who don't? And I said, are you trying to tell me to start a mission? And if you are, you need to show me where you want it and show me somebody to run it. Well, about that next week or so, I was driving down 3rd Street, and here was the West Side Baptist Church on 3rd Street with a for sale sign on it. So I went in and talked to the preacher. I said, what are you selling your church for? He said, well, it's just not a good location. We want to stay in the church. We want to continue our ministry, but we want to move to a better location. And so he asked him what he wanted for it, and he told me, and I said, well, what all goes with it? He said, well, the building goes, and then the lot next door to it goes. So I left there and I said, Lord, you've showed me where you want it. Now you're going to have to show me somebody to run it. And the first person I talked to was John Grimm. And John had sold his company. And he said, I'd love to run a mission. So we started the mission. It took the rest of that year to get it started, all the things in place. And the little chapel, the church, had the chapel in front, and then it had the Sunday school rooms in the back, and then the big kitchen across the back of the building. And that helped for about 3 or 4 months, and then we were full. And so we built a little 12-room motel on the lot beside the building, and we built all that up to code. And then we built, I bought 2 lots across the alley that had a big concrete building on it, and we made that into a men's dormitory. Well, that went on until about John Grimm died. He got cancer and died in about 1994. And his wife, Sam, took over running the mission, and she ran it for about 10 years. And while she was there, we built a big new building across the alley. It's the one that's there now, still being in use. And after we got all these buildings built to code, lightning struck the old church, burned it to the ground. And the only thing we salvaged out of it was a big cross in the chapel. And so then we had some insurance money from the church burning, and we needed to build a chapel. Now, Kim White is here. Kim went to work for us as our secretary and bookkeeper, and she's been a stronghold in our mission ever since. And then her husband Phil was on our board. And he said, I've always wanted to build a church, and so I'll be the contractor on it. So he was the contractor and didn't charge anything. And he got a lot of volunteers, Habitat for Humanity. And then he got a lot of the ministers, not the ministers, but the merchants in town, to sell us stuff a little above their cost. And so we built that chapel, and for a little less than 50% of what it would have cost if we had just contracted it out. So the Lord has blessed that mission from the very beginning, and it's will still be going. We have this year would been 35 years, and we have served over 1 million meals. We have served 260 people in these years that have passed, and we own virtually 2 blocks that we can expand. We bought a building across the street from us last year, and we're going to let the SAC lunch program move down there and be a part of our campus. This will be in the next few months. And of course, we won't charge them any rent or anything, because that's part of our mission. And so I guess I've said all that to say that's the way I've got the other half of the story. I got the money to get this wonderful recognition that I don't feel responsible for particularly. And the last thing I can think, and this is one of my favorite scriptures, to them whom much has been given, much will be expected. And that's the other half of the story.
Bob, thank you for a very, very inspirational story. We're so glad that you are our Philanthropist of the Year for 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.